They tried to banish my boat, said it didn't meet their standards, so I did something they never saw coming. I fenced off the only land path to their beloved marina, a path they didn't realize I legally owned. All it took was one letter from the HOA, an old sailboat passed down from my father, and a discovery buried in property records that changed everything. They thought I'd back down. They thought I'd roll over. Instead, I turned their power play into a community-wide reckoning. This isn't just a story about a fence. It's about fighting back when it truly matters. When I first bought the place at Silver Pines Reserve, all I wanted was peace. After a drawn-out divorce and 15 years of running in circles, this little two-story cabin by Crystal Hollow Lake felt like the closest thing to a second chance. It wasn't flashy, cedar siding, wraparound porch, a little dock out back, but it was mine. And more importantly, it came with the waterline access I needed to keep my father's sailboat. The Osprey wasn't much to look at, if you judged by modern standards, but to me, she was sacred. My father taught me how to sail on that boat before I could shave. He died unexpectedly, and that boat was all I had left of him. I kept her in perfect condition, teak-polished brass, gleaming. Every Saturday morning, you'd find me out there, tightening rigging, or just sitting on deck, coffee in hand, watching the water. Then, one morning, I opened my mailbox and found it a thick, cream-colored envelope from the Silver Pines HOA. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably another newsletter or dues reminder, but inside was a notice informing me that the Osprey was in violation of aesthetic standards. I had 30 days to remove her, or face a $100 per day fine. I stared at the letter for a long time, standing in my driveway as the lake shimmered behind me. There had never been any mention of boat rules before. And my boat. She was the most well-kept vessel on this side of the lake. Something didn't add up. And I had a feeling this was just the beginning. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone on the HOA board had misread the rules or confused my boat with one in worse shape. But that assumption didn't last long. I started walking the shoreline that afternoon, taking note of every vessel moored on our stretch of lake. Just a few houses down there was a bass boat half covered with a shredded blue tarp. Its paint was peeling, its motor visibly rusting. Farther down, a pontoon boat sat completely motionless, with mildew climbing its faded aluminum siding. Both looked like they hadn't moved in years, but no citations, no letters, no threats. Only the Osprey had been singled out. Curious, I made a few polite phone calls to neighbors. I knew people who'd lived in Silver Pines for decades. What I found was worse than I imagined. Several had received sudden citations for unrelated violations in the weeks since Carolyn Huxley became HOA president. Things like fence color, mailbox height, and lawn edging. It wasn't just my boat. It was a pattern. A deliberate one Carolyn had swept in with talk of enhancing property values and modernizing our image. Her husband Gregory, I'd later learn, had ties to a luxury development firm. The more I asked around, the more I realized this wasn't about rules. This was about leverage. They weren't enforcing standards. They were selecting targets, quietly pushing out homeowners who didn't fit their vision. And somehow, I'd ended up in their crosshairs. I still didn't know why, but I intended to find out. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk long after the sun had dipped behind the pine-covered ridge. The glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows over old property files I hadn't touched since I moved in. The HOA might have seen me as just another recent divorcee who wouldn't put up a fight. But what they didn't know was that I spent the better part of my career reading technical diagrams, architectural blueprints, and land surveys for a living. And that meant I knew how to read between the lines. I pulled out the original property documents from the purchase surveys, title, insurance packets, old developer plats, anything I could find. At first, it all looked familiar, nothing unusual. But then tucked in the corner of an older survey from the late 1990s, I noticed something strange. A small, curved sliver of shoreline marked as part of my lot. It was easy to miss, barely a few feet wide at its narrowest point, maybe 15 at its widest. But what made it significant wasn't its size. It was the path. That narrow piece of land just happened to be the only land, access to the Silver Pines Marina. I froze. I pulled up county GIS records and compared the old survey with current plats. The discrepancy was there plain as day. Somewhere during a re-subdivision years ago, the HOA had started treating that path as a common area, probably by mistake. But the legal documents told a different story. That land wasn't common at all. It belonged to my lot, and there was no easement recorded, no transfer, no permission. Nothing. The HOA, and by extension, every single resident, had been walking across my property to access the marina. For decades, I stared at the map, then back out the window toward the dock. The moonlight caught the edge of the Osprey's mast, casting a thin, silver line across the rippling water. Suddenly, everything made sense. The boat's citation, the pressure, the timing. This wasn't about some arbitrary, aesthetic standard. It was a play, a calculated move to squeeze me out so they could secure the final piece of shoreline standing between them and whatever upscale lakefront fantasy they were building. But now I had leverage. Not just emotional, legal, tangible, documented leverage. The next morning, I called Dana Kim. She arrived less than an hour later, still in her running shoes, holding a cup of coffee, and wearing that look of focused skepticism lawyers are famous for. I laid out the surveys, pointed to the records, and walked her through every inch of it. Her face shifted slowly from polite curiosity to quiet disbelief, to something that looked almost like awe. Her verdict was clear. The land was mine. The HOA had no legal claim to that path, and they'd been trespassing for years without even knowing it. She looked up at me and asked, "What do you want to do about it?" I looked back at the map, then out the window, then down at my father's old brass compass on the shelf. What did I want to do? I wanted to build a fence. The decision wasn't made in anger. It came in silence at 4:30 in the morning, staring at the lake with a black coffee cooling in my hand. I'd spent the night weighing my options. Legal action, mediation letters, threats, silence. But every path led back to the same truth. If I didn't assert my rights, they would walk right over me, just like they had with others. So I decided to make my boundary visible, not with lawyers, not with yelling, with a fence, but not just any fence, a statement. I hired a fencing company from the next county over one with no connections to Silver Pines or the HOA's inner circle. I gave them the survey, walked the line marked every inch with fluorescent flags. They didn't ask questions, I didn't offer explanations. We scheduled installation for the Friday before the big Marina fundraiser, the same event Carolyn had plastered across community emails for weeks. While she was polishing speeches and ordering caterers, I was loading cedar posts into my garage. In the days leading up to it, I worked in quiet preparation. I installed discrete security cameras facing the path, reviewed HOA bylaws one more time, and drafted a letter formal and unmistakable outlining my property rights and my intent to secure them. I had it notarized, time-stamped, and ready to deliver. But I waited, because timing, like sailing, is all about wind and pressure. The final piece arrived in the form of a text message from Bob. Another notice had been dropped at my door. This one escalated things further. Fines, contractor threats, and the possibility of placing a lien on my home. That was the moment I stopped feeling conflicted. They wanted escalation. They were about to get it, with concrete posts, legal property lines, and a locked gate that would split their plan in half. The morning of the fence installation arrived crystal clear. Not a single cloud in the sky. Summer in Colorado has a way of making everything feel clean and sharp, especially on days when battle lines are about to be drawn. At precisely 5:00 a.m., a black pickup truck from Cascade Fencing pulled into my driveway. Rick, the foreman, stepped out, clipboard in hand, no-nonsense demeanor. We walked the property line together, using the official survey markers I had pre-installed, confirming every foot of boundary. By 6:00, the first cedar posts were being driven into the ground clean, straight, intentional. And one of them went directly across the HOA's access path to the marina. By 7:15, curious neighbors began to emerge, some walking dogs, others holding coffee mugs and blinking at the unexpected construction. Most were polite, some surprised, but no one objected. I had printed copies of the survey and the deed confirmation, and I handed them out freely. Transparency wasn't just my shield, it was my weapon. At 8 sharp, I heard the tires before I saw the car. A silver Mercedes tore down the street, screeched to a halt in front of my house, and out stepped Carolyn Huxley, hair pulled tight, blazer, sharp eyes blazing. She marched straight up the gravel path, her heels clicking like a metronome of control unraveling. Without even a greeting, she began pointing at the workers, demanding they stop. I calmly stepped between her and the crew, holding out the county survey. She didn't even glance at it. She told me I was obstructing community property. I told her she was trespassing on private land. And then she pulled out her phone, said she was calling the police. I welcomed it. 30 minutes later, a patrol car arrived. The officer listened to both of us, reviewed the documentation I'd prepared, and offered a measured verdict. This is a civil matter. Mr. Carter is within his rights to secure his property. Carolyn looked like she'd been slapped with a legal textbook. By noon, word had spread like wildfire. A small crowd had gathered, some with lawn chairs, others with folding arms and satisfied smiles. Bob showed up with 2 coffees, handed me one, and sat down like he was watching a local fireworks show. By 1:00, Gregory Huxley arrived, his usual slick confidence noticeably absent. He pulled Carolyn aside near the sidewalk. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught phrases like event access, VIP embarrassment, and find a way around it. There was no way around it. By 3:00 p.m., half the fence was complete, and the only land path to the marina. The jewel of their upcoming charity event was now blocked by 6 feet of perfectly legal cedar and a padlocked gate. I had the only key to. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to threaten or argue. I just stood there, on my land, behind a wall of wood and quiet certainty. And they finally realized they weren't dealing with a man they could push anymore. By 4 o'clock, the gate was up. Not just installed, but bolted, anchored, and standing proud right across the narrow strip of land they never expected to lose. The timing wasn't accidental. By then, Carolyn's fundraiser was less than 24 hours away. The marina was supposed to be the crown jewel of her evening string lights boat tours, champagne by the lake. All part of the pitch to her husband's political donors and the local real estate elite. Only now, their guests wouldn't have anywhere to go. At around 4:15, I saw her silver Mercedes inch back into my driveway. But this time, she didn't storm out. No shouting, no threats. Just a tight smile and a folder in hand. A different tone entirely. She asked to speak privately. I let her talk. She went on about the fundraiser, the guests, the importance of the event to the community. She even tried to frame it as a charitable cause for the local children's hospital. I nodded, listened, said nothing. She finally asked if I would consider opening the gate just for the evening. That's when I offered my terms. I told her I'd consider granting temporary access, but only if the HOA formally acknowledged my ownership of the land in writing. No more ambiguity, no more encroachment. I also wanted the 3 violation notices against my father's boat rescinded publicly and without condition. She hesitated. I could see the mental math flickering behind her eyes, trying to calculate the cost of compliance versus the humiliation of event failure. But before she could answer, I added one more piece to the equation. I showed her the notarized letter I'd prepared, the one outlining the full legal situation, the survey data, and the history of unauthorized use by the HOA. I let her read every word. Then I told her something she didn't expect. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I wasn't even interested in dragging them to court, unless they forced my hand. I simply wanted what was fair. My rights respected. My property acknowledged. My father's legacy left in peace. An hour later, her entire board was standing in my living room, along with a few of the very donors she'd hoped to impress the next evening. I handed out copies of the documents, including the survey, the violation letters, and a timeline that made the picture unmistakable. And just as the sun began to set, over Crystal Hollow, I got exactly what I wanted: a signed letter from the HOA admitting the land was mine and agreeing to a 30-day negotiation period to draft a formal easement on my terms. They also agreed to rescind all violations tied to the Osprey in full. Carolyn didn't smile. She didn't even look me in the eye as she signed. But that didn't matter, because the power had shifted, and this time I held the helm. I thought that would be the end of it. Agreement, signed, fundraiser, salvaged power, dynamics reset. But fate had one more card to play, and it came in the form of a text message. It was from Martin Huxley, Carolyn's ex-husband, a name I hadn't thought of in years. His message was short. We should talk. I have information about what they're really planning. We met the next morning at a diner off the highway. He was soft-spoken, worn around the edges, but what he carried with him was nuclear. Over coffee, he laid it out. Carolyn and Gregory had been using the HOA as a tool for strategic property acquisition. Over the last 3 years, they'd quietly pressured vulnerable homeowners, retirees, widows, anyone unlikely to resist into selling. Then, using shell LLCs tied to Gregory's real estate group, they bought those lakefront homes below market value, and it was all part of a larger plan convert Silver Pines into a high-end resort enclave. Gregory had investors lined up. Carolyn had the HOA power, and together they'd nearly pulled it off until the fence stopped them cold. Martin showed me the files. Deeds, transfer records, internal memos. It wasn't just theory. It was proof. I spent the rest of that day verifying every piece. Grace, my attorney friend, helped me cross-check the holdings. 6 homes already transferred to one of Gregory's entities. Every one of them had a paper trail of violations and HOA pressure before the sale. They weren't just playing HOA politics. They were orchestrating a hostile takeover of an entire community. And thanks to one old boat, a narrow path of land and a fence, I now had the evidence to stop it. I didn't call it a protest. I didn't even call it a meeting. I just sent out a quiet message. Come to my backyard at 7. We need to talk about what's happening to our neighborhood. By 6:30, folding chairs were filling in rows across my lawn. By 7:00, people were standing along the tree line, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months. Old-timers with sun-faded Silver Pines caps. Young couples balancing toddlers on their hips. 50, maybe 60 people total. They came curious. Some came angry. A few came afraid of what they might hear. I started with the boat. I showed them the letters I'd received, each more aggressive than the last. Then I showed them pictures I'd taken of other boats on the lake, boats in worse condition that had never been sighted. I explained how the violation wasn't about appearance. It was about pressure. Then came the documents, projected on a screen in black and white. The survey proving my ownership of the access path, the notarized statements, and finally, the kicker, Martin Huxley's files. Property transfer records, LLC registrations, HOA violation histories lined up next to closing dates. You didn't have to be a lawyer to see the pattern. First came the citations, then came the offers, then came the sales. One by one, neighbors stood and spoke. Frank described how he and his wife had been fined for repainting their porch. The same color it had always been. Eleanor, a retired teacher, recalled how her bird feeders suddenly became violations. After 20 years, Henry shared how Carolyn had warned him off the record that his RV wouldn't last long if he didn't move it. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a playbook. What hit hardest wasn't the financial pressure. It was the slow erosion of dignity, the way neighbors were made to feel unwelcome in their own homes, the way Carolyn and Gregory had twisted the concept of community into something cold and extractive. When I showed them the development plans, the proposal Carolyn had drafted 3 years ago, suggesting Silver Pines could become an exclusive lakefront experience, the mood shifted. This wasn't just corruption. It was a betrayal. Bob stood up slowly with a kind of quiet fury I hadn't seen in him before. He spoke about what Silver Pines used to be before the meetings became mandatory and the violations became personal. Then, in front of everyone, he called for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board. The motion passed unanimously except for 3 abstentions. Carolyn Gregory and their longtime ally Brenda from Lot 12. We didn't cheer. We didn't jeer. We just looked at one another and knew something had shifted. The spell had been broken. They had tried to divide us, isolate us, and quietly transform our lakeside homes into a resort portfolio. Instead, we had become a community again. The next morning, the interim board got to work. Bob was named acting president. Grace took over as vice president. And 3 other longtime residents, each with clean hands and clearer intentions, filled out the rest of the temporary seats. Their first act was swift. All violation notices issued under Carolyn's term were rescinded. Every citation, every petty fine, every so-called aesthetic warning gone. Then came the audit. Grace led the charge, aided by Linda, who turned over meeting minutes and finance logs with quiet urgency. It didn't take long to find the cracks. Tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled into Marina beautification without board approval. No competitive bids, no receipts. Just vague line items and inflated invoices, most tied back to companies with ties to Gregory. A formal complaint was filed with the state's Real Estate Licensing Board. Another was filed with the Attorney General's office regarding HOA misuse of funds. By the end of the week, Carolyn and Gregory had put their house up for sale. They didn't attend another board meeting. They didn't say goodbye. The so-called luxury dream had collapsed under the weight of truth and community resolve. And as the Marina fence stood tall and proud, we began restoring not just access, but trust. What they tried to build for profit, we reclaimed with principle, and this time no one was backing down. Summer faded slowly that year, and with it, the last traces of the old regime. The fence still stands clean cedar, now weathered to a soft gray, with a brass plaque at its gate that reads private property, preserved with purpose. I left the gate unlocked most days, secured not by a padlock, but by a coiled rope and an anchor. My quiet reminder of why this all began. The Osprey sits at the dock like she always has. I polished her hull and re-varnished the wood trim. On calm afternoons, I take the neighborhood kids out on the lake, teaching them how to read the wind, like my father taught me. We host cookouts. Now, sunset sails. There's laughter where there used to be tension. Decisions get made in the open, with real votes and real voices. I never wanted to be the face of a rebellion. But when they tried to erase my family's legacy, they uncovered something stronger than policy. They found resolve. And now, when people walk past that gate to the marina, they don't just see a fence. They see the line one man drew, and the community that stood behind it.